It was the winter of 1906 when whispers first began to circulate across the flat, snow-drifted fields of Michigan. Farmers, trudging through the frost with lanterns in hand, told each other of a family who had all but vanished from ordinary life. They were not gone in the way of graves or departures. No, they still lived in a weather-beaten farmhouse at the edge of the woods, their chimney smoke rising faintly against the white horizon. But the neighbors swore that these people, once ordinary, once present, no longer spoke to the living. Their words, if they ever let them escape, were meant only for the dead. The family's name is lost in fragments, tangled in church records, faded ink in county registries, and contradictory reports from newspapers that struggled to make sense of their silence. Some called them German immigrants. Others claimed they were descendants of New England settlers who had fled west in search of farmland. What united every account, however, was the fear. A family that lived in complete refusal of ordinary human contact. A family that seemed to sit at the dinner table with chairs set aside for those who had already passed. Travelers who knocked on their door, whether to deliver a letter, to sell a tool, or to warn them of a coming storm, returned pale and shaken. They said the man of the house opened the door only halfway, his eyes drifting past the visitor, as if someone else stood behind them, someone unseen. They said the woman of the house rarely blinked, her lips parting as though whispering words that weren't meant for human ears. And they said the children never laughed. Instead, they wandered the yard at dusk, speaking in hushed tones to the air, nodding and pausing as if they were listening to a reply. The rural Midwest of the early 20th century was no stranger to superstition. The line between faith and fear, between religion and folklore, was thin. Spiritualism. The belief that the living could speak to the dead through seances, mediums, or silent rituals was spreading like wildfire in small towns and growing cities alike. Michigan, like much of the Great Lakes region, had seen its share of seance parlors and backroom gatherings. But this was something different. The townsfolk whispered that this family had taken the idea further than anyone dared. They did not simply consult the dead on occasion. They had abandoned the living altogether, creating a household where every word, every gesture, every breath was an offering to those who had already crossed over. At first, neighbors dismissed it as eccentricity, a kind of madness born from grief. Perhaps they had lost too many relatives to disease. Perhaps the influenza, which had swept through the region in earlier years, had hollowed their hearts beyond repair. But then came the stories that unsettled even the most skeptical. Farmers claimed to see candlelight in the windows at midnight, arranged not like casual lamplight but in careful circles, flickering as if guiding unseen presences. Others swore they heard voices rising from the house on windless nights, low tones and rhythmic whispers that did not sound like a family in prayer, but like a gathering of mourners repeating words in a language they had never learned. The silence they maintained with the living grew heavier. They stopped attending church. They stopped buying goods at the market, relying instead on deliveries left at the end of their lane, payment left in exact change without a word. They let their farm fall into neglect, crops untended, fences sagging, and yet they themselves looked neither starved nor desperate. It was as though they were being sustained by something beyond bread and water, nourished by conversations no one else could hear. The county sheriff, urged by frightened citizens, visited once in the spring thaw. He returned shaken, saying little, only muttering that the children had asked him questions he could not repeat. Questions that seemed to come from the grave. The sheriff never went back, and he never wrote a formal report. By summer, the family had become more than a curiosity. They had become a shadow that weighed on the town, a presence that seemed to grow larger the more it was avoided. The neighbors crossed themselves when passing their lane, some even whispering prayers under their breath. And still, the family went on with their silent rituals, speaking only to the dead, as though the rest of the world no longer existed. And so we are left with a mystery that begins, like all haunting tales, not with violence but with silence. A silence that spread from a single farmhouse into the hearts of those around it, until even the most practical farmer began to wonder whether the dead truly answered. Whether the thin barrier between this world and the next had, in that house, worn itself away. The year 1906 placed Michigan at a strange intersection of progress and superstition. Detroit was already roaring into industrial growth, its factories glowing at night, steam and smoke churning into the cold sky. Automobiles had begun to transform the streets, and railroads cut through the land like veins of iron. Yet only a few hours west of those factories lay a different world: quiet townships, wooden farmhouses, communities stitched together by shared hardship and the church bell's toll. Here, time moved slowly and memory weighed heavily. The family in question belonged to this quieter Michigan, far from Detroit's clamor. Their house, described in county whispers, was an unpainted farmhouse with peeling clapboard walls, surrounded by fields that once promised corn and rye, but had since fallen to weeds. These farmsteads were common in the early 1900s, large enough to sustain a family, but vulnerable to drought, pests, or the cruel edge of winter. Life on such land was defined by endurance. Neighbors relied on one another for survival, borrowing tools, helping with harvest, carrying news when the postman's route grew thin. To refuse that bond, to turn inward and cut oneself off, was seen as not only strange, but dangerous. To understand why the silence of this family unnerved the community so deeply, one must look at the culture of the region. Michigan in the 19th century had been a landing ground for immigrants: Germans, Scandinavians, Irish, Poles. They brought with them traditions, dialects, and faiths that mingled uneasily with the Protestant backbone of small-town America. German families in particular carried memories of folk beliefs, rites of mourning, prayers for the dead, charms against restless spirits. Though many shed these practices in favor of strict Lutheran or Catholic teachings, traces remained, especially in isolated farmhouses where old habits persisted in whispers. At the same time, the Midwest was gripped by the spiritualist movement. It had begun decades earlier, in 1848, with the infamous Fox Sisters of New York, who claimed to hear mysterious rapping sounds from the dead. From there, seances swept across America, parlors filled with candlelight and hushed voices. Mediums promised communication with lost children, lost husbands, lost mothers carried away by disease. By the late 1800s, spiritualism was not a fringe belief but a booming subculture. Newspapers reported on seances with the same tone they gave to politics or war. In Michigan, particularly in rural counties where cemeteries were thick with fresh graves, the desire to speak with the departed found eager ground. This hunger to commune with the dead was fed by grief on a national scale. The Civil War had left countless families without closure, bodies buried far from home, identities lost on battlefields. The epidemics of the 19th century, cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis, robbed households without warning. When death visited so often, so suddenly, the promise of hearing a voice from beyond was irresistible. Even ministers debated whether spiritualism was a devil's trick or an extension of Christian faith. Could not a loving God allow his children to speak across the veil? Against this backdrop, the family of 1906 did not appear in a vacuum. They lived in a cultural climate where the dead were never far away, where grief was a language spoken daily. Yet what set them apart was the extremity of their devotion. While most people balanced ordinary life with the occasional seance, this family seemed to abandon life altogether. Their refusal to engage with neighbors broke the unspoken rule of survival in farming communities, that no one could live without the support of the living. Isolation was not uncommon in rural Michigan. The land itself bred solitude-dense forests, long winters that trapped families in snowbound homes, miles of empty fields between households. Farmers sometimes grew eccentric in their solitude, clinging to routines or beliefs that others found strange. But isolation coupled with silence was more unsettling. In towns where gossip was currency, to know nothing of one's neighbors was to fear them. Religious tension deepened that fear. Protestant ministers thundered from pulpits against spiritualism, calling it necromancy. Catholics warned against false visions. And yet, behind closed doors, some congregants still lit candles, still pressed their ears to tables in seance circles. The contradiction created an atmosphere where fascination coexisted with dread. When news spread of a family that refused all ties with the living, many saw it as proof that spiritualism could rot a household from within. Adding to the unease was the cultural shift of the early 20th century itself. America was modernizing. Cities glowed with electric light. Telegraph wires buzzed with instant communication. Trains carried goods and letters at speeds unimaginable a generation earlier. The world was speeding forward, yet this family seemed to move backward, retreating into rituals older than the county itself. In an age of modern medicine, they spoke to the dead instead of doctors. In an age of industry, they let their farm decay as though the land no longer belonged to the living. Michigan, with its lakes and forests, carried its own folklore. Native tribes had long spoken of spirits tied to the waters, of ancestors who lingered. European settlers layered their own tales atop these, stories of phantom lights, voices in the trees, haunted farmhouses where tragedy had left its mark. The land itself, with its long winters and lonely expanses, encouraged belief in presences just out of sight. It was said that silence in the snow could make a man hear his own fears. For the family of 1906, silence became not just atmosphere, but existence. Social records from the time show that grief often fractured families. Widows lived alone in black dresses for decades. Parents of lost children set extra places at the table. Some families kept the rooms of the dead untouched, dust gathering on clothing and toys. The family in Michigan may have been an extreme embodiment of this grief, their silence a kind of refusal to accept death's finality. In a society that valued resilience and faith, such refusal looked like madness. What made their story endure was not only their silence, but the timing. By 1906, the world around them was shifting irreversibly. Cities were growing, machines replacing hands, newspapers spreading both facts and rumors faster than ever. To hear of a family retreating into communion with the dead felt like a ghost of the past refusing to let go. They were both an echo of old-world mourning traditions and a warning against the excesses of spiritualism. And so, the stage was set. A rural Michigan farmhouse steeped in snow and silence, inhabited by a family that turned their backs on neighbors, on markets, on the church. A community torn between fear and pity, unsure whether to call them heretics, lunatics, or victims of grief. And behind it all, the broader culture of America at the dawn of the 20th century, a nation straddling modernity and superstition, progress and ghosts. It is within this historical frame that their silence becomes more than eccentricity. It becomes a symbol of a culture haunted by its dead, a people unable to escape the voices of loss, and in that silence we find the seed of the story that will unfold. The first rumors began in winter, when the snow lay heavy on the fields and the roads turned to frozen silence. A postman, trudging through knee-high drifts, told of a farmhouse where no one answered the door, though lantern light flickered in the window. Days later, he returned and found the same scene, shadows moving behind curtains, but no voice, no greeting, no human word. The silence was unsettling, more so because in rural Michigan, hospitality was not a matter of choice, but of necessity. To refuse to answer a knock was to break a code older than the township itself. Neighbors at first explained it away. Perhaps sickness had taken hold or the family was grieving. Such things were common, but then the small incidents multiplied. A farmer passing by on horseback claimed he heard voices through the open loft window, soft and low like a group in prayer. Yet when he stopped to listen, he realized the voices were not speaking to each other. They were calling names, names that belonged to people long buried in the township graveyard. He rode home faster than he wished to admit. By spring, the strangeness grew harder to dismiss. Children who strayed near the farmhouse said they saw members of the family standing in the yard at dusk, their heads tilted as though listening to someone behind them. No words were spoken aloud, but the stillness of their posture was enough to frighten. One boy, no older than 12, swore he heard the sound of weeping carried on the wind, though when he drew closer he found only a woman at the fence line, lips moving without sound. The county doctor, summoned by concerned neighbors, tried to pay a visit. He knocked on the front door, then the back, but was met with the same silence. At last the door creaked open and a man gaunt, his face pale as wax, stood in the frame. When the doctor explained his visit, the man raised a finger, not in welcome but in warning. Then, without a word, he shut the door again. The doctor left unsettled, carrying with him the image of eyes that seemed both vacant and aware, like a gaze fixed on someone standing just over his shoulder. Whispers spread quickly in towns like this. By summer, the family had acquired a grim title among locals: the listeners. Markets and church pews buzzed with speculation. Some said they were mediums conducting seances day and night. Others claimed madness had overtaken them, that grief had closed their tongues. A few, more fearful, insisted they were possessed, their silence a pact with something unholy. Yet not all encounters were terrifying. A widow named Mrs. Hanlon reported that when her child fell ill, she dreamed of the family's matriarch, who stood at the foot of her bed and whispered that the child would recover. The next day, the fever broke. Mrs. Hanlon insisted she had not imagined it, that the family spoke not to the dead but for them, carrying messages that others could not hear. To her, they were not cursed, but chosen. Still, darker incidents piled up. One evening, a traveling salesman claimed he saw a candle-lit gathering in the farmhouse parlor. Through the thin curtains, he could make out figures seated around a table, hands resting palm down, heads bowed. Yet at the head of the table was an empty chair, and it was toward this absence that all faces were turned. He swore he saw the chair shift slightly as though someone unseen had leaned upon it. He left without knocking, certain he had glimpsed a ritual meant for no living witness. Livestock in neighboring fields began to behave strangely. Horses shied when led past the farmhouse, eyes rolling, hooves striking the frozen ground in panic. Dogs refused to enter the yard, whining and pulling against their leashes. One farmer awoke to find his chickens slaughtered in the night. No predator tracks in the snow, only a line of barefoot prints leading toward the silent house. He swore never to pass that way again. By autumn, the family's silence had become unbearable to the community. The township council debated whether to intervene. Some wanted the sheriff to investigate, to force the family into communication. Others argued it was not a crime to grieve, not a crime to refuse the world. Yet a common fear lingered. What if their silence was a contagion, a darkness that could spread? What if others, drawn into their circle, also abandoned the living? One night, a group of young men dared each other to approach the farmhouse. They crept across the field and peered into a window. What they saw remained divided in their retelling. Some said the family sat in silence around a table, faces blank, eyes closed, as though waiting for something. Others swore the figures at the table included more than the living members, that pale, indistinct shapes hovered among them. The boys fled, stumbling in the dark, their courage broken. They told their story in whispers, their voices trembling, as though speaking too loudly might summon what they had seen. Winter returned, and with it came tragedy. A neighboring farmer, lost in a blizzard, was found dead in the snow a few yards from the family's fence. His face was frozen in terror, his arms outstretched as though reaching for something unseen. Some believed he had simply lost his way and collapsed. Others whispered he had seen the family in their yard, speaking to someone only he could glimpse in the storm. Whatever the truth, his death deepened the farmhouse's reputation as a place of dread. Even the minister, who had dismissed the rumors as idle gossip, began to falter. He admitted to hearing, on a still night, the faint tolling of a bell, though no church was near. The sound, he said, came from the direction of the farmhouse. He described it as a funeral bell, slow and mournful, each note fading into silence. He told his congregation to pray, but his own voice shook as he spoke. As years turned, the family remained unchanged. Their fields went to ruin, their roofs sagged, yet still they stayed. No one saw them buy supplies at market or attend services. They seemed to exist in a world parallel to the township, visible but unreachable. Some claimed their faces grew thinner each year, their clothes older, their voices forever unheard. Others said they had seen them grow strangely luminous in moonlight, their presence uncanny, as though the boundary between flesh and spirit had blurred. And so the incidents built upon one another, a tower of whispers that cast a long shadow over the township. The family that spoke only to the dead became less a household and more a legend, their silence a wound in the community's memory. Each retelling sharpened the dread until the line between truth and imagination dissolved. All that remained was the silence itself, heavy as snow, lingering across the fields of Michigan. The silence of the family did not remain a private matter for long. In a town where every birth, marriage, and funeral was carried by word of mouth, the refusal to speak became a kind of negative presence, louder than gossip itself. By 1907, the farmhouse had grown into a question mark hanging over the entire county. What did it mean for a family to turn away from the living? And how should the living respond? Neighbors, bound by necessity, tried at first to excuse it. They brought baskets of food to the doorstep, left sacks of flour or bundles of firewood against the wall. Sometimes these gifts disappeared overnight. Sometimes they remained untouched until weather spoiled them. To some, this suggested gratitude cloaked in secrecy. To others, it was evidence that the family no longer ate as ordinary people did. They feed on memory, One woman muttered at the general store, "Not bread." The doctors of the county men, trained in rudimentary medicine but eager to show themselves enlightened, offered their own theories. Some believed the family suffered from melancholia, a condition catalogued in medical texts of the day as a wasting sadness that stole both appetite and speech. Others leaned on the newer language of hysteria and nervous disorders, claiming the silence was contagious within households weakened by grief. One physician even suggested they had succumbed to a rare form of catatonia, a paralysis of will that left the body functional but the voice extinguished. None of these explanations satisfied the townspeople, who continued to hear whispers through the walls and see movements in the night. Science could describe silence, but it could not account for the voices that seemed to drift from nowhere. Clergy wrestled with the matter more fiercely. The township minister, his sermons sharp with warnings, declared that the family had turned away from God's word in favor of necromancy. To him, their refusal to speak was less a symptom of illness than a sign of spiritual corruption. "They pray to shadows," he told his congregation, "and shadows are all that will remain of them." Yet privately, he confided to his wife that he feared confronting them directly. Faith demanded courage. But something about the stillness of the farmhouse unsettled him more than any argument of doctrine. Catholic voices in the nearby parish took a different view. For them, communication with the dead was not always forbidden. After all, prayers for souls in purgatory were a staple of faith. Some argued that perhaps the family's silence was a form of excessive devotion, a misguided but earnest attempt to live among their departed loved ones. This interpretation was more sympathetic, yet it did not lessen the unease. Whether heretics or martyrs, the family remained outside the boundaries of the living community. The newspapers, hungry for stories that stirred curiosity, could not resist. Small columns began to appear. Mysterious household refuses human company. Strange silence in rural Michigan. Reporters described the sagging farmhouse, the thin smoke from its chimney, the glimpse of pale faces at the windows. Some wrote with pity, painting the family as tragic victims of grief. Others leaned toward the sensational, suggesting seances and spirit voices. Readers from Detroit and beyond devoured these tales, their imaginations inflamed by the idea of a household where speech was reserved for the dead. Psychologists, too, began to speculate. The early 20th century was a time when Freud's theories had just crossed the Atlantic, and words like subconscious and repression were entering popular discussion. Could it be, some wondered, that the family was reenacting a trauma too great to name, that by refusing to speak, they had turned language itself into a ritual reserved for the departed? In academic journals, such questions became curiosities. But in the township itself, no theory could dispel the creeping fear that their silence might swallow others who came too close. Reactions varied sharply by individual. Some neighbors refused to pass the farmhouse at all, detouring miles out of their way to avoid its fields. Others lingered, drawn by a mix of dread and fascination, staring at its windows as if expecting a pale hand to lift the curtain. Children made dares of it, testing their courage by walking to the fence at night, only to flee in terror at the sound of a creaking shutter. To the young, the family became a living ghost story, whispered in schoolyards and carved into desk wood. Not all responses were fearful. A handful of locals insisted the family's silence carried wisdom. They pointed to dreams in which lost relatives appeared after a glance toward the farmhouse. They claimed to hear their names carried on the wind when they stood at the edge of its fields. For these believers, the family was not damned but gifted, a conduit to a world everyone else had lost. To them, the silence was not absence but presence, filled with voices too subtle for ordinary ears. Still, the majority saw danger. Survival on the frontier, even in 1906, required unity. To cut oneself off from neighbors, from markets, from church, was to invite suspicion. What if disease spread within the silent house and crossed to the town? What if, in their devotion to the dead, the family forgot the laws of the living? Fear hardened into hostility, and whispers grew into calls for action. Some demanded the sheriff force them to speak, to prove they were not harboring madness or crime. Others warned that such interference might unleash something better left untouched. In this tension, the family became more than themselves. They became a mirror for the community's anxieties about grief, about change, about the fragile border between life and death. To some, they were tragic mourners. To others, dangerous heretics. And to nearly all, they were a story that could not be ignored. The very act of refusing to speak had made them unforgettable. By the time the second winter arrived, the township had reached a quiet stalemate. No one intervened, but no one forgot. The farmhouse stood like a wound in the landscape, its silence spreading through conversation, through rumor, through fear. And in that silence, the community revealed itself. Fearful, curious, divided, unable to decide whether the family's devotion to the dead was a sickness to be cured or a mystery to be endured. The breaking point came in the dead of winter. By January of 1908, the silence had festered into something intolerable, not only for the family but for the entire township. Food was scarce, snowdrifts swallowed fences, and every night the wind carried a sound that many swore was not the wind at all. Some described it as a chorus, others as a slow chant, always distant yet always near. Neighbors, sleepless and frayed, began to gather at the tavern to trade stories. One farmer claimed he had heard his mother's voice dead these 10 years, calling his name from the direction of the farmhouse. Another swore he saw lanterns moving across the family's frozen fields, though no one had walked there in weeks. With each account, the divide between curiosity and fear widened, until finally the community demanded action. The sheriff, pressed by a restless crowd, agreed to visit the farmhouse with 2 deputies. They trudged through knee-deep snow until they reached the door, their lanterns throwing long shadows against the frost-bitten boards. They knocked, waited, and heard nothing. When they tried the handle, it turned with little resistance. The door opened into a silence so heavy it seemed alive. Inside, the air was cold and dry, the kind of cold that bites harder indoors than out. The deputies raised their lanterns, revealing furniture draped in white cloth, walls stained with candle soot, and a floor littered with brittle stalks of dried herbs. At first glance, it looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Then they noticed the chairs. In the main room, 12 wooden chairs were arranged in a perfect circle, each facing inward. On every chair rested a personal item: a shawl, a child's doll, a man's hat, a folded apron. Some of these belonged to the living members of the family, others, unmistakably, to relatives long dead. The sheriff whispered a curse under his breath. His words seemed swallowed by the air. When he tried to speak louder, his own voice cracked, as though sound itself resisted intrusion. One deputy, unnerved, insisted they leave, but the other pressed forward, lantern trembling in his hand. That was when they heard it. A low murmur, rising from the floorboards, as if the house itself were speaking. Not one voice, but many, overlapping in a language that was not foreign so much as broken fragments of familiar words, syllables of old prayers, sobs, laughter, unfinished sentences. The sheriff barked for the deputies to hold steady, but even he could not hide the tremor in his voice. They followed the sound into the back room, where the family had once gathered for meals. The table was gone, replaced by a rough altar of stacked stones. Upon it burned candles whose wax had melted into grotesque shapes like faces sagging in grief. On the wall above hung photographs, sepia portraits of the dead, their eyes clouded by age and shadow. In the far corner sat the family themselves. 5 figures motionless, their heads bowed. They did not stir when the lawman entered, nor when lantern light touched their faces. Their lips moved faintly, as though whispering, but no sound emerged. The murmurs in the floor, however, grew stronger, as if the silence of their mouths had been transferred into the house itself. The sheriff stepped forward, demanding they speak. His voice cracked like a whip in the stagnant air. No reply came. He reached to touch the eldest, perhaps to shake him from his trance. The moment his hand brushed the man's shoulder, the murmurs ceased. The silence was instant, absolute, and heavier than before. Then the eldest raised his head. His eyes, sunken and hollow, fixed on the sheriff with a gaze that seemed both vacant and knowing. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, yet it filled the room like a tide. "You should not be here. They do not like the living." Before the sheriff could reply, the candles sputtered, and every lantern flame shrank to a thread of blue. A draft swept through the house, though no door had opened. The deputies swore later that the photographs on the wall shifted, their expressions altering in the flicker of light, smiles drooping into frowns, blank stares turning accusatory. Then the voices returned, louder than before, echoing from every direction. They rose into a frenzy, a babble of grief and command, laughter and sobbing, until it was impossible to tell if the family was chanting with them or merely drowned beneath the tide. The lawmen fled, stumbling into the snow, their lanterns guttering out as the door slammed shut behind them. The sheriff never entered the farmhouse again. He would later claim he had done his duty, that he had seen nothing criminal, only sickness and sorrow. But those who heard his story noticed the tremor in his hand, the way he looked over his shoulder when speaking of that night. His deputies were less restrained. They warned others never to approach the house after dark, never to linger near its fields, never to answer if they heard a familiar voice carried by the wind. Yet not everyone heeded the warning. Curiosity proved too strong. Within weeks, small groups of young men dared each other to approach the farmhouse, pounding on the door, shouting insults, even throwing stones. Some swore they saw faces at the windows, pale and watching. One boy claimed a hand touched his shoulder, though no one stood behind him. By morning, he was feverish and could not speak above a whisper. The climax of the ordeal came one stormy night in February, when lightning tore across the sky and the town awoke to screams from the direction of the farmhouse. Neighbors rushing to their windows swore they saw the upper story alight with a sickly glow, as if dozens of lanterns burned within. Some claimed they heard singing, not in any earthly melody, but in a droning harmony that rose and fell with the thunder. By dawn, the farmhouse stood silent once more. The snow around it was unmarked, as though no one had passed. But those who ventured close swore the air still vibrated with echoes, as if the walls themselves remembered the night. After that, few dared approach. The family remained unseen, their windows dark, their fields barren. And yet, when the wind turned just right, the township still heard voices carried across the frozen land, sometimes laughing, sometimes calling, sometimes weeping. The silence of the family had become something greater, something no sheriff, no minister, no physician could explain. It was not simply grief, it was communion, and it was unbroken. Time has a way of dulling memory, but in the case of the family that spoke only to the dead, the years did not erase, only reshape the story. By the spring of 1908, the farmhouse was avoided by nearly everyone in the township. Paths once worn by wagons grew over with weeds, fences collapsed under neglect, and the fields once fertile hardened into clay. The family themselves were seen less and less until at last they vanished entirely from public sight. No one could say with certainty when the last member passed or departed. Some claimed they were buried in secret by their own kin, lowered into shallow graves behind the house without ceremony. Others whispered that they had followed their voices into the earth, retreating deeper into communion with the dead until there was no distinction between spirit and flesh. When officials eventually did venture back years later, they found the house empty, its rooms stripped bare, as though the family had evaporated. Yet emptiness did not mean silence. Travelers passing near the ruins insisted they heard whispers in the wind, words carried across fields that no longer bore crops. A minister who braved the journey in 1912 wrote in his diary that he felt a congregation unseen, assembled in perfect stillness, waiting for a sermon that would never end. He did not return. For the townsfolk, the story hardened into folklore. Parents warned children not to wander too close, not to play games of summoning or calling out to imagined companions. "The dead will answer," they said, "but you won't like what they have to say." The phrase became part of local superstition, a grim proverb spoken half in jest, half in fear. Psychologists of the early 20th century, when hearing the tale, framed it as an extreme case of shared delusion, perhaps a familial psychosis exacerbated by isolation and grief. In their view, the silence of the family was not a supernatural communion, but a tragic collapse of the mind, reinforced generation after generation until it became ritual. Anthropologists suggested another explanation, that what appeared as madness may have been a cultural survival, a fragment of old-world spiritualism, twisted and intensified in the harsh winters of rural Michigan. Yet none of these explanations satisfied those who had walked near the farmhouse and felt the cold grip of unseen eyes. For them, the mystery could not be reduced to psychology or culture. It lingered because it resisted simplification, because when the wind rose just right, the voices did not sound like delusions. They sounded like mothers, brothers, husbands, wives. They sounded like home. In the decades that followed, the story of the family became less about history and more about the nature of silence itself. Historians noted how communities under strain often created legends to explain what could not be faced directly. In this case, the legend centered on a family who had withdrawn so far from the living that they found belonging only among the dead. Was it grief, madness, or had they tapped into something older, something woven into the land itself? Even today, the ruins of the farmhouse are gone, swallowed by forest and weather, but the story persists. Locals still recount it at gatherings, shaping it anew for each generation. Some describe the family as victims, trapped by sorrow. Others portray them as keepers of forbidden knowledge, willfully choosing the company of spirits over the burdens of mortal life. Both versions carry the same chill. That silence, once chosen, becomes a doorway. What makes the story endure is not just its horror, but its reflection of universal fears. The fear of losing loved ones and reaching for them in the dark. The fear of grief so heavy it becomes language. The fear that in seeking answers, one might discover that the line between the living and the dead is thinner than anyone dares admit. And so the epilogue is less a conclusion than an echo. The family that spoke only to the dead left no graves marked, no letters explaining their silence, no witnesses who could speak without trembling. What remains are voices half heard, half imagined, carried by the wind over the empty fields of Michigan. Perhaps they are nothing more than the memory of grief etched into the minds of a community that could not understand. Or perhaps, as some still whisper, they are what the family promised, the voices of the departed, calling to anyone willing to listen. Whether one believes in folklore or in the failings of the human mind, the legacy is the same: silence that does not comfort, silence that does not heal, silence that lives on. A silence that feels, even now, like a voice just about to speak.